Ew.
All right, well, this week we are in the third part of what we call a series here. If this is your first time with us, we take our messages, we group them together under a common idea or story or theme, and we call it a series. So today we're in the last part of a three-part series called Self-Conscious. Self-Conscious. Now here's what you need to know if you haven't been with us over the past few weeks. We're looking at an origin story. Whenever you learn about where someone has come from, it tends to shed light on why they are the way that they are, right? So if you learn about Batman's origin story, you know a little bit more about what his issue is with the dark and with bats and his parents, right? I was watching The Last Dance on Netflix. It's a documentary about Michael Jordan. Anybody see it? Nobody. All right, it's about the Bulls. You got to check it out. Anyway, I was wondering, what goes on in Michael Jordan's head? What motivated him? And he said very casually in an interview in that documentary that his older brother, got all the attention from his dad because he was better than him at basketball. I was like, that's interesting. All right, he's fighting for something that meant so much to him. That was something that drove him. It was because when you learn about where someone came from, how they are, why they are, starts to make sense often. There's an enormous part of the global population that understands the story in Genesis 1, the first book, the first chapter of the first book, first few chapters in the first book, to be the origin story of the human race. And it has a lot to say about why we are the way that we are, why we work the way that we work. And so what we've been doing over the past few weeks is looking at that story, taking a close look at that story. And what I said last time and the week before was that I know that this story can be hard to believe because it seems kind of out there. There's a God who just speaks things and poof, they are there. And there's a talking animal, and that's a whole nother thing, right? But what I ask you to do is take your doubts, reasonable doubts, your hesitations, reservations, put them aside and just look at what's happening in this story. And you might see that there's something so profound happening. A lot of people think that this story happened literally, exactly as it was described. Other people believe that there's authority to it, but that it's more symbolic. Wherever you land, even if you don't believe it's true at all, just look at the story that was written thousands, not hundreds, thousands of years ago. And it's amazing to see how accurate it is when it comes to describing the human condition. So the story starts out with nothing. And what we're told is that God speaks order into chaos. And each time he says that it's good, it's attractive, it's pleasing. He brings order to chaos, and then he creates the human race, and he's like, very good. It's a world that's described as all good all the time. And so I want to zoom in and find out what's going on in the human heart. What's the human experience like? Is it just laughter and joy all the time? What does it feel like to be a human in a world that's perfect? And what we're told, you know this if you're with us, the only thing we're told is that the people living in this very good world, it says Adam and his wife, this is actually the Hebrew word for man, humankind. Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. That's all we get about the people. There's something being communicated there. Now, it's not just that they had no clothes on and they didn't care. It's that they were fully known and fully loved. They were completely exposed, totally seen, and completely embraced. And while you may not have been around thousands of years ago, you know how this feels. Your strongest relationships are the ones that are the closest to this. And we'll say things like, they know the real me. I can be myself around them. I feel seen and embraced. Right? And so what that tells us alone is that there's part of us that really needs and desires that. But if you know the story, you know it doesn't stay that way. It doesn't stay very good the whole time. There's a talking serpent who convinces them to do something they weren't supposed to do. And the short version of the story is they decide they need to define what's good for themselves. Like this God who has made everything very good cannot be trusted to continue to give them good. They need to decide on their own terms. And so they do. And we're told that's the moment when it all falls apart. And what happens? What enters the story? Well, it says the eyes of both of them were opened. They began to see things differently. They realized they were naked. There was a self-realization. They became conscious of their own exposure, self-conscious. And so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They go from totally exposed, fully known, fully loved, to hiding, covering, and fearing what's going to happen if you see the real me. What has entered the story here is something we call shame. Shame. Now, for me, shame, I was not introduced to this concept until after college. And yet, according to this story, which is why we're talking about this here, this is the issue at the heart of the human predicament. This is at the heart of the brokenness in the world. And it's not just like humiliation or embarrassment. It's this attack on the identity. We've been talking a lot about Brené Brown, who's a shame researcher. She would say, that shame is the experience of believing that I'm flawed and therefore I'm unworthy of love and belonging, of human connection. It's why rejection hurts so bad. Not measuring up hurts so bad. The language we use to describe this, like we don't walk around saying like, oh man, I feel so unworthy of belonging. We'll say like, I feel like I'm not enough. I'm never enough. I'm not a good enough person. I'm not a good enough father. I'm not a good enough friend. I'm not a good enough parent. I'll never be enough at work. I'll never be enough at home. I'll never be in shape enough, smart enough, like never enough. According to the biblical author here, this is at the heart of the broken human condition. And so it causes us to do a few things. The first week we talked about God and our shame. It causes us to run from God. These people, they run and they hide. And what we said on week one, and the thing that I want you to walk away with, maybe more than anything else from this series, is that God goes looking for them. He is the cure, not the cause of their shame. We see this more completely when Jesus shows up and gives everything for us to show, like, yes, we're flawed. There's no arguing that. But in spite of that, we're fully known and fully loved. In fact, the loudest message from the church should be, isn't always, but should be, I am flawed. And yet I am deeply loved and completely embraced. God is the cure, not the cause. The next week we talked about the effects of shame on me, like me and my shame. If you were here last week, you saw the mannequin, right? Shame makes us make coverings for ourselves. In the text, the original language, what you see is the whole story. God's making things for these people. Eventually, when this happens, they need to now make for themselves. And so they create a version of themselves that they present to the world. We call this identity management. It's now my job to create, manage, and maintain a version of me that's perceived as enough, that I hope will be accepted. And so I've got to pretend to be somebody that's worthy of acceptance, embrace. And we do this with our jobs. We do this with our income. We do this with our accomplishments, with how we look, with how we're perceived. It's this hope that when I'm seen, right, I will be perceived as enough. And so we like shape this version and present it to the world. Identity management. And so this week and the time we have left, we're looking at what shame does to us and our shame. And while the last two things, the first two effects we talked about are kind of subtle, like it's not always easy to pinpoint when they're at work, this one is painfully obvious. And the goal of this morning is to get you to see the thing we're talking about and right away identify it, recognize that shame has entered the conversation or the situation. And so Here's the story. The man and the woman, they eat from the tree, they run, they hide. They're in the bushes, in the trees. God comes looking for them, and God asks the man a pretty simple question. Pretty straightforward. He addresses what's been done, and he says, Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? Now, I'm no genius, right? But this is a layup. This is an easy one. This is a yes or no question. But we don't get a one-word answer. We get a lot of words. And so the man said, the woman, that was a mistake. The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and, well, here he enters the story, and I ate it. Like, small there. This isn't in the original version, but we know, because we know. At that moment, the woman, looked over at the man and was like, oh, yeah? You just wait till I get out of this bush. So God plays along, and he says, then the Lord God goes and addresses the woman, and he says, what is this you've done? What happened? And she does the same thing. She says, well, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. She's at the end. What we see when shame runs its course is the presence of blame. Blame. This is the thing. This is the thing that's easy to spot. It's offloading responsibility. It's offloading criticism. It's offloading the negativity. It's offloading feedback that hurts, right? Because if shame causes us to create versions of ourselves, remember identity management with the mannequin? If I've got to create a version of myself that's perceived as acceptable, we'll make coverings to produce that, but then we blame to protect it, right? Because I can't have anything speak to that version of me to make it perceived as unacceptable. And so we blame. Blame enters the story here. Brene Brown, who writes a lot about this, she says that where you see blame, when someone's blaming, when fingers are pointing and words are flying, shame is riding shotgun. It's right there. It's right there. There's a theologian who writes about this whole experience. He says, as soon as blame enters the story, the reader is given a full phenomenological depiction of the shame experience. There's a self-realization, there's running and hiding, there's covering, and then there's scapegoat behavior. There's blaming. It is offloading the negativity, like hot potato. Tom, after the first service, he's like, you got to say blame thrower. Yeah, that's what's happening. There's blame throwing going all over the place, and it's to protect who I am and what I'm worth, because shame is an attack on the identity, who I am and what I'm worth. So I've got to blame, get the responsibility off of me, because I don't want what that says about me. Now, the hard part about this, the really difficult part about it, is that it's self-destructive and counterproductive. It does the exact opposite of what you're going for. At the heart of shame, we talked about this, is this desire for acceptance and connection. But what blame does is draw a wedge between two people who want to be connected. It beats disconnection to the punch. I'll give you an example. So just last Saturday, and I have permission to tell this story. Last Saturday, it was getting late, and in my backyard, Allie and I have this tent. It's got a wood-burning stove inside of it. They say it's a sauna. It's not. It's a tent. But it helps me sleep, and it's become this nice little thing where after we put the kids to bed, we go in there and we just talk and kind of catch up. And so it's Saturday night, I go outside, I'm setting things up, I sit down, and Allie's not there. And I'm like, okay, well, wonder what her problem is. And I'm sitting there and I begin to sweat internally and externally, and she doesn't show up. And so I stay in there for 20 minutes, and I get out, I'm cooked, I walk inside, I'm drenched in sweat. And she looks at me and she's like, "You were in the sauna?" And I was like, "Yeah, where were you?" She's like, "I was in here waiting for you. I thought you were working on stuff for tomorrow. And so now we just can't go in?" And we've just started going back and forth. I'm like, "Well, why didn't you come outside? What do you think I was doing outside? It's getting dark out." And we're back and forth and back and forth. And here we are. We're both disappointed. We didn't get to spend time together. And yet we're blaming one another and pulling each other further apart. That's what happens when blame enters the story. And what we're both doing is defending our sense of who I am and what I'm worth. I'm not willing to accept that responsibility. You have it. It's hot potato. And it does the exact opposite. It's destructive. So during the Korean War, there's a prison camp in Korea. And the death rate for prisoners during the Korean War is one of the highest ever. It may even be the highest. And what's amazing is that the conditions in that war camp were not that much worse than other war camps throughout U.S. history. But they were strategic in the way they handled the prisoners. They had a system where if one prisoner tattled on another prisoner, they would be rewarded. And the prisoner who was tattled on wouldn't even be punished. So people logically were like, well, they wanted the extra food, they wanted the small rewards, and so they looked for one another to step out of line, and they knew, hey, they're not gonna be punished anyway, so who cares? Let's just cash in. But what it did was create a culture of blame, and it disconnected them from one another. And eventually, the most common cause of death in that POW camp was something they called give-up-itis. People felt so disconnected and isolated, they would literally walk off and die of hopelessness. They didn't even have a name for it. And it's because they created a culture of blame. In this story, the Genesis story, we're told in the very beginning, God looks at the human race and says, it is not good for man to be alone. And so that's when there's more than one. Right away, he recognizes that independence and isolation are not good in this situation. And so he solves the problem. Blame undoes that solution. It disconnects people from one another. And you know this, when you get into an issue and blame enters, it never brings you closer together. It pulls you further apart. And it's one person usually trying to throw shame on the other person, their shame on the other person in the form of blame. When you see blame, recognize that somebody is fighting for the way they're being perceived. Somebody feels the need to justify who they are and what they're worth. So there's two questions here, at least for me. I'm thinking, all right, well, there's got to be a place then for assigning responsibility. In fact, a few weeks ago, we did a series called Sticky Situations. We talked about Jesus in Matthew 18 and solving conflict, where you go to someone, you say, hey, I got a problem. You did that, and that's not okay. So what's the difference? If somebody approaches you and says, I have a problem with what you did. How do you know when it's blame and when it's reasonable? Or if you want to do that to someone, how do you know when it's okay and when you're just offloading shame? For me, the question is pretty easy. Am I concerned about being right or making things right? When Jesus gives instruction on how to handle conflict, the goal is reconciliation. Do I care more about us making things right between us, or me coming out of this as the one who wasn't wrong? There's a huge difference. And if you go into it with the goal of making things right, being right really, you recognize it's really not all that important who's more right or more wrong. It just kind of slips away, and the goal ultimately is accomplished of reconciliation. Do I care more about being right or making things right? Now, if we're talking about offloading responsibility, or if not just with an argument, but maybe even receiving negative feedback or criticism, or if someone confronts you and you want to know whether you're receiving that in a healthy way or if you're allowing it to become something that triggers shame within you. The question is, am I allowing this to speak to what I've done or who I am? And there's a big difference the way we register those things internally. So I'll give you an example, and maybe this will be helpful, maybe not. But for me, I've got a notepad. I always have some kind of notepad, typically, that I'm walking around with. And let's say, for the sake of the illustration, that this is where I keep my notes, my feedback, my actions. It's how things went, what went well, what went poorly. I want to keep track of the things that I'm doing so I know if they're good or if they're bad or how they can improve, right? So the actions and the feedback about the actions go in the notepad. If someone has something to say to me, it goes in the notepad when it's about my actions. But sometimes when shame creeps in, if somebody's got a problem with something that I'm doing and I allow it to speak to my identity, it doesn't go in the notepad. It ends up going on the name tag. So what I did was dumb. Or am I dumb because of what I did? Right? One is about the action. The other one is about the identity. At this point in the message, last service, Tom took out his phone, took a picture. Like, thanks. When someone approaches you, they may have good things to say. You know, I've done some dumb things as a parent. And for the good of my children, I want someone to be able to say, I think what you're doing is detrimental to the well-being of your kids. But if shame has taken hold within me, I'm not hearing that. Right? I'm going to defend myself and allow it to speak to my identity because it goes on the name tag. But maybe their delivery wasn't great, maybe their timing wasn't bad, but maybe there was some truth to it. And so it goes in the notepad. The question is, when you hear criticism, feedback, blame, do you allow it to go on the name tag or the notepad? The difference is enormous, and it will allow you to handle shame or not handle shame. So my challenge for you, what if this week, you leaned toward confession, toward owning your slice of the pie instead of blame? Confession, if you've ever been in this situation where you just say, hey, that was my bad, it like immediately deepens the connection. Whereas like blame does the exact opposite. What if you leaned toward confession instead of blame? What if you want to be really extreme, what if for 7 days you decided you wouldn't defend yourself? Somebody says something about you or what you've done, you just let it go. Or at the very least, you wait 24 hours to readdress it. Come back to it 24 hours later and say, hey, I had a problem with this. But at least you know you've had time to process it and put it in its place. At the end of the day, what all of this comes down to is who gets to say who you are and what you're worth? Is it your performance? Is it your job, your actions, how good your kids behave, how much money you make? Who gets to say? Where we've ended every one of these messages is at the central story of what we believe, we call the gospel, that Jesus gave everything for you to show you that you're worth everything to him. And no mistake you make, no criticism you get can shake that. But we need to find our confidence there and return to that. Not once, but every single day. Remind ourselves that that's the reality we live by. And if this is new for you, I get that it can seem out there. But the idea is that there is a sense of identity that cannot be shaken by how well you're doing or how much you're winning. We're going to wrap up the series today with a story. It's not a story from my life or one that I made up. It's a story, it's called You Are Special by Max Lucado. It's a kid's story. It's about shame. The word shame doesn't appear in it, but it has something profound, and I think it perfectly sums up what we've been getting at over the last 3 weeks. So here we go. It's You Are Special by Max Lucado, and the illustrations are by Sergio Martinez. We'll have him up here. The Wemmicks were small wooden people. All of the wooden people were carved by a wood carver named Eli. His workshop sat on top of a hill overlooking their village. Each Wemmick was different. Some had big noses, others had large eyes, some were tall and others were short. Some wore hats and others wore coats, but all were made by the same carver and all lived in the village. And all day, every day, the Wemmicks did the same thing. They gave each other stickers. Each Wemmick had a box of gold star stickers and a box of gray dot stickers. Up and down the streets, all over the city, people spent their days sticking stars or dots on one another. The pretty ones, those with smooth wood and fine paint, always got stars. But if the wood was rough or the paint was chipped, the Wemmicks gave dots. The talented ones got stars too. Some could lift big sticks high above their heads or jump over tall boxes. Still others knew big words or could sing pretty songs. Everyone gave them stars. Some Wemmicks had stars all over them. Every time they got a star, it made them feel so good. It made them want to do something else and get another star. Others, though, could do little. They got dots. Punchinello was one of those. He tried to jump high like the others, but he always fell. And when he fell, the others would gather around and give him dots. Sometimes when he fell, his wood got scratched, so the people would give him more dots. Then when he would try to explain why he fell, he would say something silly, and the Wemmicks would give him more dots. After a while, he had so many dots that he didn't want to go outside. He was afraid he would do something, such as forget his hat or step in the water, and then people would give him another dot. In fact, he had so many gray dots that some people would come up and give him one for no reason at all. He deserves lots of dots, the wooden people would agree with one another. He's not a good wooden person. After a while, Punchinello believed them. I'm not a good Wemmick, he would say. The few times he went outside, he hung around other Wemmicks who had a lot of dots. He felt better around them. One day, he met a Wemmick who was unlike any he'd ever met. She had no dots or stars. She was just wooden. Her name was Lucia. It wasn't that people didn't try to give her stickers, it's just that the stickers didn't stick. Some of the Wemmicks admired Lucia for having no dots, so they would run up to her and give her a star, but it would fall off. Others would look down on her for not having stars, so they would give her a dot, but it wouldn't stay either. That's the way I want to be, thought Punchinello. I don't want anyone's marks. So he asked the stickerless Wemmick how she did it. It's easy, she replied. Every day I go see Eli. Eli? Yes, Eli, the wood carver. I sit in the workshop with him. Why? Why don't you go and find out for yourself? Go up the hill, he's there. And with that, the Wemmick who had no stickers turned and skipped away. But will he want to see me? Punchinello cried out. Lucia didn't hear. So Punchinello went home. He sat near a window and watched the wooden people as they scurried around, giving each other stars and dots. It's not right, he muttered to himself, and he decided to go see Eli. He walked up the narrow path to the top of the hill and stepped into the big shop. His wooden eyes widened at the size of everything. The stool was as tall as he was. He had to stretch on his tiptoes to see the top of the workbench. A hammer was as long as his arm. Punchinello swallowed hard. I'm not staying here. And he turned to leave. Then he heard his name. Punchinello? The voice was deep and strong. Punchinello stopped. Punchinello, how good to see you. Come and let me have a look at you. Punchinello turned slowly and looked at the large, bearded craftsman. You know my name? The little Wemmick asked. Of course I do. I made you. Eli stooped down and picked him up and set him on the bench. The maker spoke thoughtfully as he looked at the gray dots. Looks like you've been given some bad marks. I didn't mean to, Eli. I really tried hard. Oh, you don't have to defend yourself to me, child. I don't care what other Wemmicks think. You don't? No, and you shouldn't either. Who are they to give you stars or dots? They're Wemmicks just like you. What they think doesn't matter, Punchinello. All that matters is what I think, and I think you're pretty special. Punchinello laughed. Me? Special? Why? I can't walk fast. I can't jump. My paint is peeling. Why do I matter to you? Eli looked at Punchinello. He put his hands on those small wooden shoulders and spoke very softly. Because you're mine. That's why you matter to me. Punchinello had never had anyone look at him like this, much less his maker. He didn't know what to say. Every day, I've been hoping you'd come, Eli explained. I came because I met someone who had no marks, said Punchinello. I know, she told me about you. Why don't the stickers stick on her? The maker spoke softly, because she's decided that what I think is more important than what they think. The stickers only stick if you let them. What? The stickers only stick if they matter to you. The more you trust my love, the less you care about their stickers. I'm not sure I understand. Eli smiled. You will, but it will take time. You've got a lot of marks. For now, just come to see me every day and let me remind you how much I care. Eli lifted Punchinello off the bench and set him on the ground. Remember, Eli said as the Wemmick walked out the door, you're special because I made you, and I don't make mistakes. Punchinello didn't stop, but in his heart he thought, I think he really means it. And when he did, a dot fell to the ground. Over the past few weeks, this idea of shame, it's a heavy thing. And how what God says speaks to that can be a difficult thing. There are going to be times when it feels like you don't understand. And so if I can challenge you in any way, it would be to spend time daily, even if it's just a minute, to remind yourself of what he says about you. And the more you do, the more that we do, the less the dots and the stars will be able to stick. Let's pray. God, it's amazing. It's amazing that we don't have to work to be seen as valuable to you. That concept can be so foreign to us in a world that is obsessing over performance and status and achievement, the gold stars. But would you give us a new perspective? Would you show us what you say about us? And would you bring us back to that daily? In those moments when we feel the grip of shame, bring us back to what your voice has to say about who we are and what we're worth, how what Jesus has done for us, what that says about who we are and what we're worth. Would you help us to know that we're valuable because we're yours? Teach us to trust the things that you say. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.